If you're a sociopath or a psychopath and you're running a big country and you've screwed up the finances of that country to the point where the system is ready to collapse, one of the things you might try is to foment civil unrest so that when the financial crisis comes, things get really crazy. People are out in the streets because they're already primed for it. And then you step in and declare martial law and put the Constitution aside. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that was part of a plan that is now being implemented in the US, because that kind of a scenario fits with pretty much all that our leaders are doing right now.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for June 3rd through June 10th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 2023 1-ounce Gold Britannia at just $59 over spot. We also have backdated 1-ounce Silver Britannia at $3.10 over spot. Next, we have pre-33 XF Gold $10 Liberty coins at just $59 over melt. And finally, we have a highly limited supply of 1/10 ounce Platinum Britannia at $59 over melt. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're delighted to have this returning guest, John Rubino, the former founder of dollarcollapse.com and now the founder of his own Substack. We'll talk about that later. Joins us this Wednesday, June 5th, 2024. John, thanks for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Hey, Donegan, good to talk to you again.
We were discussing just now how much there is to talk about, that it's hard to narrow it down to what we can fit into even a long format interview. One of the things that is in a lot of people's minds is the behavior of the metals markets. They, after a decade or more of seeming range bound and difficulty in breaking out, gold broke out to new nominal all-time highs quite convincingly against the US dollar, after already having been at all-time highs against most other international currencies. But silver, after having failed at two previous attempts to break 30, finally did so quite convincingly over the past month, and now seems to be, after a retraction, perhaps finding support there. Can you talk to us about what you're seeing on major movements on the gold and silver markets and what you believe that portends going forward?
Well, yeah, gold and silver have finally had some nice moves, and it's finally starting to pull the mining equities along for the ride. So suddenly it's a fun market to be in. But yeah, the best bull markets still have brutal corrections in them. So what we're seeing right now is to be expected after the nice run. Silver went from the low 20s to the low 30s. That's a good run by any standard. And for it to be correcting from there, because when something goes up by a third, it creates a lot of people with profits to protect. And so the normal way to respond to that is to sell some small amount of your position. And that pushes prices down and brings in other people who wish they'd sold at the very top, but now don't want to be left out. And so you get a correction. And that's probably all that's happening with precious metals right now, because it does feel like we're in a legit commodities bull market, which means buy the dip in not just gold and silver, but uranium and copper and many other things. But at the same time, the economy is due for a recession, and we're seeing a lot of not really headline numbers yet, but under the surface numbers that are pointing towards a slowdown. And with stocks being wildly overvalued and most of the financial sectors of the world being overleveraged right now, a recession is a dangerous thing. So we need to be paying attention to that too, because that would affect precious metals if we tip into an equities bear market and that creates a generalized recession. Then we could have another 2008 or 2020 when stocks tanked and it pulled precious metals down along for the ride. In both cases, they bounced off of that bottom. We had a really nice V bottom where they just took off because the Fed stepped in and started easing. So that whole thing could repeat. And that would be bad in the short run for precious metals and phenomenally good in the long run. So the takeaway there is don't give in to fear of missing out in markets like this. Don't just jump right in all at once, because you might be doing it right before a big correction. So keep buying, but do it in a dollar cost averaging way or with low ball bids or whatever. Or if you're in the stock market, write put options as a way of getting stocks at a discount. And, do keep buying, but don't buy in a really aggressive way that puts you at risk of a sudden correction.
It is interesting, human psychology being what it is, that breaking up your strategic move into perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 tactical tranches can lower your stress level remarkably, because if the train leaves the station and takes off, you think, well, at least I've got my foot in the door. Or if there is a withdrawal, you go, hey, I kept some of my powder dry. Now I can take advantage of that. So it puts you in a mindset of being able to see the opportunities rather than just feeling like you have to perfectly guess the exact bottom or guess the exact top, which usually ends up with people either being really angry at themselves or this idea of analysis paralysis, where they're waiting so carefully to get it right that they don't do anything at all, which is also not a good thing when preparedness is absolutely essential in this environment.
Yeah, see, everybody who gets into investing goes through a stage where they think they can call the market. They're right about a couple of things, and they think they can be right about everything from then on. And then the market teaches them a really humbling lesson. So what you don't want to do is learn that lesson with all your money all at once. If you learn it with just enough money to hurt, then that's good. That taught you a lesson you need to learn. But if you learn it with everything, then you go broke, and maybe you just never trust your own judgment again, and you never want to be involved in finance in any way. And by the way, Dunnigan, you kind of pointed out a really good lesson for life in general, not just markets, that whatever you're doing, you want to have some part of your plan being something that if things don't work out, you can use that one part of the plan as a way to make yourself feel better about what's happening. You need to be able to hang your hat on some kind of reason for optimism. And so, for instance, in stocks or buying physical precious metals, if you're dollar cost averaging and the price goes way down, then you can say, okay, then with my next buy, I'm going to get a lot more ounces. This is actually a good thing. So you have a reason for optimism, and that's psychologically really healthy. You don't ever want to make a bet that's so big that there's nothing good to be said about a correction. You always want a correction to at least, or some other thing in the market that happens that's not ideal for you. You always want it to have an aspect that is positive, that you can focus on while you're getting through it.
One of the things you mentioned a little while ago was about the possibility, or something, a probability, that the authorities may have to cut interest rates rather than raise them anymore, even though inflation seems to be roaring and not coming under control at all. There are those who are critics of the Fed's policy, saying they never really acted seriously because the real rate of inflation was always higher than they were going to be willing to raise interest rates, because there's a reality that it could actually clobber all kinds of things: bond portfolios, banks, and businesses that rely on commercial loans, et cetera, stock markets, et cetera. So could you take a look? But then you said there's some voices coming out now, even from officialdom, saying maybe this is a good thing. So can you talk to us about that?
Well, there was always going to be a point in this process where the world's central banks just give up on trying to control inflation because the alternative is too brutal. In other words, if you raise interest rates high enough to actually choke off inflation, you bankrupt all the sectors of the financial world that require low interest rates to survive. And that gives you a 1930s style deflationary depression, which nobody in charge is going to want to see on their watch. So at some point, they're going to give up and they're going to say, all right, we'll just accept higher inflation. What's interesting about the present day is that we're starting to hear voices calling from authority. And what that means is that it's becoming normalized, this idea that maybe we need to choose a 3 or 4% inflation rate going forward as a way of inflating away our debts to give us a chance to manage all the debt that we've taken on. And the idea being that if you keep the inflation rate above the interest rate, then the real cost of your debts goes down, because you're paying off those debts at rapidly depreciating currencies. Now, this is crazy, but it's the kind of rationalization that people are going to come to at some point. And it looks like we're hearing the early voices in that process. The reason why this doesn't work, and it'll fail spectacularly, is that people respond to their expectations for inflation. So if you raise interest rate or raise inflation above the average interest rate, then what does the rational person do? They go out and borrow a bunch of money in order to take advantage of the fact that the dollar is falling fast enough to make that debt cheaper going forward. And so instead of inflating away your debts, you generate an increase in the amount of debt in the system and make your problems even worse. And that's kind of what we've done for the last 50 some years, since the 1970s. And if we explicitly go for 4 or 5 or 6% inflation, we'll get that on steroids. And that's why that process will fail. So that's why modern monetary theory won't work. And that's why this idea of accepting a higher inflation rate won't work. But it looks like we're going to try it. So we'll get to find out if I'm right about it just absolutely not working and blowing up in our faces. But I think I am. I think it will.
In an era where we've traditionally been told what is not true and not told what is true. For example, the very foundation of our fiat currency and the foundation of the Fed in 1913 and all of that, the income tax mandatory and all that has been disguised and spun and hidden and people to a large extent who are earners, savers, and retirees are not aware that the thing that is the most toxic, that is stealing their earnings, retirement, and savings, is the destruction of the currency. We've talked to you about that. I mean, your old website, the dollar collapse, was about the destruction of the currency, and it's by design. It's part of the inherent flaw mathematically in the design of fiat currencies, where there's an interest component that becomes exponentially toxic and makes it impossible to hide this, what they like to call, you call it inflation, but it's really theft. It's a tax on everyone. And we've been able to offshore some of that by forcing other countries in the world to buy our debt. We've been able to hide it, or at least it's been less visible because of the effects of technology advancements that have made things less expensive. So you don't see as much price inflation in electronics and other things like that. But eventually, if they keep upping the ante here, and maybe they're boxed into a corner where that's mathematically inescapable, we can't hide it anymore. And it starts showing itself in ways that everyone's going to be noticing. Any comments from you on this big lie and this absolutely regressive tax on everyone of inflation as a policy, and how it can no longer be hidden? And so it's a good thing because we can't hide it anymore.
Yeah, inflation is a hidden tax, basically. They're lying to us about our tax rate because they're stealing from us in a way that doesn't show up in the official marginal tax rate. And they got away with that until very recently by not including things like stocks, bonds, and real estate, which go way up in inflationary times, in the consumer price index. So they could say, oh, look, your inflation is only 2% a year. Meanwhile, house prices were going up 8% a year, stocks were going up 15% a year. Bonds were rocking too. We had this massive long bond bull market that just ended lately. And that allowed the government to lie by omission, basically, and it also enriched the already rich at the same time. So it served two purposes. One is that it made the guys financing political campaigns even richer and really happy because of that, and more likely to continue to funnel money into the political system. And it hid the damage that was being done from people. And so the people who were being hurt by this process didn't really have anything to say about it because they didn't know what was going on. Just lately, though, inflation started to spread from financial assets to the assets that are measured in the consumer price index. All of a sudden, food went way up and car prices went through the roof, and rents went just crazy lately, and along with college tuition and medical bills and all the stuff that form part of the cost of living for most people. And so that changed everything. In 2022, we had like 8.75% official inflation and probably 15 or so percent real inflation in the cost of living, in the CPI. And so now, the whole country is freaked out by this because so many people who were just covering when their cost of living was what it was in 2019 have seen that cost of living go up by 30 or so percent, and now they can't pay all their bills. And so you have this spectacle of politicians and economists going on CNBC or MSNBC and saying, people are just so ignorant. They don't understand how good they've got it now because inflation is back down to 3%. And the unemployment rate is this awesome low 3.5% or 4% number. And this is great. This is a really happy economy. But they're saying it to a country full of people who had their cost of living raised by a third and who can't pay for the rent and to put gas in the car and to feed their kids all at once. They have to choose which one of those things they're not going to do. So they're not happy. And so that's why our politics is so unsettled right now, because you've got this huge section of tens of millions of people in the US who just can't get by in the current system. And they're being told by politicians and economists in the mainstream media to ignore what they're seeing and trust the experts. And so basically the last 10 years has been this process of the experts screwing up in one way or another and different groups of people figuring it out and no longer trusting the experts. And now, after the pandemic and after the Iraq war, and it just goes on, and after the weaponization of the criminal justice system just lately for political aims. So various groups of people tune into various expert failures and then see that and then stop trusting the big systems out there. And pretty much now we're at a critical mass where virtually everybody has been fooled or lied to in a way that they understand. And so they no longer trust the system. So you're getting that thing you and I've talked about called the shrinking trust horizon, where we have come to the conclusion that whether it's the public health system or the military or the political system or the mainstream media or healthcare or whatever, they can't be trusted. So we only trust people we can see and look in the eye and shake hands with. And so we buy our food from local farmers or we grow it in gardens at home, and we tune out the mainstream media. The combined viewership of CNN, Fox, and MSNBC is plunging. The Washington Post is laying off reporters now, and the New York Times has been laying off reporters forever. And Sports Illustrated magazine basically just closed down. The bloodbath in the media is ongoing and everywhere. And the reason for that is because they turned out to be untrustworthy. So once you get to the point where nothing is trustworthy, then why would anybody trust the money that is run by these experts who are part of the big systems out there? If we can't trust healthcare and we can't trust food and we can't trust politics, then there's no reason to trust money anymore. And that's the crack-up boom that the Austrian School of Economics talks about, where we just give up having faith in the currency because we know it's going to be inflated away at an accelerating rate going forward. And we just bail on financial assets. So this is something we've talked about a bunch of times in the past, but we've never been closer to that point than we are right now. So I think this is a fascinating time in economic history and a terrifying time for anybody who isn't prepared for what's coming.
Yeah, one of the fascinating aspects, you just mentioned the Austrian crack-up boom prediction by Mises and his cohort, is that when people realize that their cash is trash, they'll try to just dump it to get anything real. And it's been happening. Usually the wealthy figure that out first. And so you end up with the central banks and so on have been accumulating gold, for example, over the last 4 years, more than they had purchased in the previous 60 years combined. And we're also seeing this in terms of a grab of physical metals off of the exchanges, which is an interesting development because historically the exchanges were not primarily a tool for physical delivery. They were a price-setting mechanism, futures contracts for hedging and that sort of thing. But we saw just last Friday The COMEX, 21,414 contracts stood for delivery of gold. That's 66.6 tons of gold. It beats the previous record of 19,828 contracts back on September of 2022. And yesterday, a further 5,447 contracts, 16.9 tons, stood for delivery. So we're seeing record physical off-taking from the exchanges. This has also exhibited itself in terms of an arbitrage between the East and the West. But can you talk to us about this phenomenon, this new run from, and perhaps it's the flip side of the coin, literally, of the Austrian crack-up boom as cash or U.S. debt is being dumped, especially by foreign holders. There's this grab for physical metal off the exchanges, and in many cases, repatriation by countries who don't hold their physical metals personally but would like to.
Yeah. What we're seeing is happening for different specific reasons in different sectors of the commodity space. But it all amounts to the same thing. People are converting their currency into real stuff. And, silver, which you mentioned, is a great part of that story because it has basically two things going for it. One is that industrial applications are growing for silver, and the demand for silver in solar panels and satellites and electric cars, and it goes on, is rising at an accelerating rate. And right now, silver is in deficit, meaning that the world's silver mines aren't producing enough silver to cover what industrial users and investors are demanding right now. So we're running through the above ground stocks of silver. And when that runs out, then you go from deficit to shortage, which usually means prices have to go up to increase the supply somehow. And an analyst just came out lately with a time frame for that, and he said 1.5 to 2 years before we run out of above ground silver, and the price mechanism has to really kick in order to allocate what there is out there. And India, for instance, is a good example of the response to that because they just imported more silver in the first quarter of this year than in all of 2023. And they're normally a big importer of silver, so that we're talking serious numbers in that case. And they, at the same time, repatriated 100 tons of gold from London back to India. So take what India is doing and kind of spread it out around the world, and you've got different entities, whether they're countries or companies or individuals, doing variations of that. They're buying silver coins, or they're stockpiling gold because they see a currency crisis coming, or they're buying every bit of copper they can get their hands on, because if we're going to electrify the world, it's going to take 3 times as much copper as comes out of today's copper mines. And then what are we going to do then? And so everybody has their reasons, but it all involves a thought process in which they conclude that the currency that they have is worth less than the commodities they could buy with that currency. And you reach a point where it dawns on everybody that we're literally running out of this stuff, which is another way of saying we've got tons of currency relative to the amount of commodities that there are out there, and we really need to convert all the currency that we have into these commodities if it's at all possible. And so that, within the framework of the crack-up boom, that means the price of real things goes through the roof, but not because there's a huge increase in the supply of currency. It's not inflation as we typically envision it. It's a loss of faith in the amount of currency, or the currency that exists now. And so nobody just wants to hold those currencies anymore. So that's a conceptual difference that works out to the same thing, which is that the price of real stuff goes through the roof. And the market value of financial things like government bonds and bank stocks and Goldman Sachs equities and things like that tank. And you get a revaluation in both directions, where commodities relative to the size of the global economy, they go up, while financial assets relative to the size of the economy go way back down. There's a cycle in the gold market where the S&P 500 and gold's market cap fluctuate against each other, and sometimes they're trading at 1-to-1, and other times they're trading at this massive premium of the S&P 500 over gold. And lately, we've been in a situation where the S&P 500 was vastly more valuable than the market cap of gold, but we're heading back in the other direction now. And if we go back the way previous cycles have gone to one to one, then that takes the price of gold to $15,000 or $20,000 an ounce. So that's one metric that you can look at that's fundamental, that gives you a reasonable way of estimating the value of gold. And it could easily do that because it's done that a couple of times in modern history already. So it's not unprecedented. It's just something that happens when the cycle swings all the way to the other side. And it wouldn't be a surprise at all to see that happen again this time, because all the other numbers are so far out of whack that we should expect the pendulum to be swinging really wildly for the next decade or two.
One of the things, we've been interviewing you on this channel since 2013 when we were called Reluctant Preppers. And one of the principles of preparedness is you've got to have the assets that you need before it becomes obvious to everyone that it's needed. Because, if Noah waited until the flood started before he started building the ark, it would have been too late. Or if Joseph hadn't started storing up 7 years of grain during the years of plenty in Egypt, people would say, why would you be storing up grain? There's plenty of grain. But he was building silos and put in charge of all of that by Pharaoh. And when the lean years come, from all over the world, people came. First, they were bringing their currency to buy food. Then they were bringing their lands and being willing to trade those. And finally, they were bringing themselves and saying, well, here we are, you tell us what to do, we'll work for food. So this hierarchy of realizing that the necessity of having the real things that are going to be needed early on so that you can position yourselves is absolutely key and critical to surviving and thriving in challenging times. And that decreasing trust horizon that you've talked to us about and you've written about extensively over the last several quarters is something that I think a lot of people can relate to. They're turning to alternative sources, independent media like Liberty and Finance and like your Substack. Can you tell people where they can find you on Substack so that they can follow you more closely?
Yeah, I'm at rubino.substack.com, and most of what I write about there is actionable ideas for how to prep for what's coming, because there's lots of things we can do, and not all of them are immediately obvious to people, but they seem obvious, after we find out what they are. So I'm learning as I go, too, because I'm turning up a lot of things that I haven't been doing and really should be doing, so I'm getting with it. So far, so good. It's been a fun little community in that Substack, and I hope it continues to grow.
One of the other trends that we didn't touch on just now, but it's, I think, related to breakdown of trust in many institutions in our society is the breakdown of law and order. Sometimes this is then fomented or subsidized by those who would like to topple regimes and that sort of thing. When you get late stage of empires, there's been some press come out recently about major funding from renowned sources that people will know the names, they've heard them before, fomenting uprisings that seem to come back, whether it's riots in foreign countries or riots within the U.S., and paid and organizers and press that are sympathetic to these causes and causing this sharp increase in civil unrest. It underscores all the more reason, if we're heading into an era of reduced trust and people being upset because their livelihoods have been stolen from them, that it's likely that there's going to be more civil unrest going forward. And people who are concerned about that want to know how can they prepare for this. And one of the things you've talked about is get to know your local community, get to know your local farmers, get to know your local sheriff, that sort of thing. We've even had one viewer who's gone off and enlisted to become a sheriff's deputy because he wanted to be part of the solution and helping to keep some law and order in a positive way in his local community during times of trouble that he sees coming. So any thoughts from you on that idea that societal breakdown can parallel monetary breakdown that you've been focusing on so far?
Yeah. In really good times, you don't have to do a lot of things that our grandparents and great-grandparents did. I mean, you literally don't have to know your neighbors. If you're making good money and a secure job, and you've got a few friends at work, and there's no real need to widen your social circle beyond that, because things are good and they're going to stay good, and you're fine the way you are. That's not the ideal lifestyle in hard times, though. When trouble comes, you want to know the people who live around you, and you want to be friends with them, and you want them to understand that you've got their backs, so they have your back when the time comes. And that's just the way we all lived up until very recently. And then we became really mobile and relatively rich, and we thought community didn't matter, but it does matter in the times that are coming. So yeah, one of the big projects that we should all be coherently, consciously pursuing is to getting to know the people around us and making friends in our community and in our neighborhood, so that when the time comes, there will be strength in numbers. You'll be part of a group where everybody's trying to help everybody else get through it. And that's a huge deal, because you can prep, you can put away food and water and stuff like that, and have some guns and everything, but you're still an easy target if you're just a lone wolf, if you're just there all alone. The fact that you have lots of food socked away actually just makes you a target. It doesn't protect you in any way. But if you're part of a town where everybody's got the same attitude, and they're all looking out for each other, then you've got an excellent chance of coming through this in pretty good shape. So that's the question. How do you want to approach what could be really chaotic, really hard times? Do you want to do it alone, or do you want to do it with friends and neighbors together? And I think when you think about it, the answer is obvious.
It's interesting because we live in Central Florida, and every late spring, early summer, there are informational talks you can go to learn about hurricane preparedness specifically, and find out who your community emergency response team leaders are, and where the fallout shelters are just in case, and where things like that, and storable supplies such as water and non-perishable food and things that you should have on hand, and batteries and all that fun stuff. It's interesting that I haven't yet seen such efforts being discussed in the context of potential civil unrest, although we've got what could be a very contentious election on its way this fall. And if the past is prologue, we've seen this cyclical, it's like the 4 years cycle. We have back where I used to live, we had the 18-year cicada cycle, the 20-year cicada cycle. They come back, and it seems like there's these organized, those who would like to organize civil unrest seem to come back around presidential election cycles. And this one seems to have the earmarks of what could be potentially the most contested of all so far. So any thoughts from you on applying lessons we've learned in other areas of preparedness to civil unrest specifically?
Well, see, the nice thing about prepping is that no matter why you do it, probably a lot of what you're doing applies to any kind of a crisis, right? Because a lot of the hurricane stuff you're doing will work more or less for civil unrest for you. You're putting in place kind of an informal structure of people who have some authority when things get tough, and you know who they are, they know who you are, and you're taking steps to make yourself reasonably well prepared for it. And that'll work in a financial crisis, that'll work in civil unrest, that'll work for a natural disaster. So you don't have to do prepping for every single thing that could happen. You just need to do general prepping. Now, about the whole political civil unrest thing, we could spend the entire show just talking about how crazy our politics have gotten lately. And let me say a couple of things. One is that if you're a sociopath or a psychopath and you're running a big country and you've screwed up the finances of that country to the point where the system is ready to collapse, one of the things you might try is to foment civil unrest so that when the financial crisis comes, things get really crazy. People are out in the streets because they're already primed for it. And then you step in and declare martial law and put the Constitution aside, and you don't have to take the blame for that financial crisis that you caused, because there's nobody to blame blame you because you've taken control of all the media outlets, and you got the military on the streets and stuff like that. You've declared martial law, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if that was part of a plan that is now being implemented in the U.S. because that kind of a scenario fits with pretty much all that our leaders are doing right now. So we could easily see civil unrest that isn't even organic, that doesn't spring up independently, that is organized from the top down as a pretext for that authoritarian government that they're looking at setting up. Now, the second thing is that our politics are such a mess right now, in large part because we've been running elections that are inherently untrustworthy. You know, when you're using voting machines that don't leave a paper trail and can be hacked and are connected to the internet, of course, nobody's going to trust the results of things like that. When you're having mail-in balloting, where all they do is, vaguely look at a signature and compare it to another signature and don't really think beyond that. Or when you have voting rolls that are full of dead people. Just the other day, there was a headline about some county in Arizona has voting rolls with more people on it than there are people in the county. So whoever loses elections in that kind of an environment feels like they got cheated just because cheating is really easy to do. So they assume the other side did it. And we've got an election like that coming up where if it's a close election, whoever loses is going to assume it was stolen and they're going to hit the streets. So if it's not a landslide, what we really need is a landslide to avoid civil unrest here. And if it's not a landslide, if it's 50.2% versus 48.9% or something like that, then people are going to assume they lost because the other side cheated. And we are going to see serious civil unrest in a lot of places. And that's something we should be preparing for. That's not something we can prevent at this point because none of us individually are in charge of these idiotic election systems that are being set up around the country. And none of us are in control of the lies that the media is telling or the things that the criminal justice system is doing right now. We can't control any of that. All we can do is go out and vote and hope our vote counts. But if it feels like it doesn't, then we're there. We're at that point that you were talking about where, we're on the verge of civil war. And that could be as soon as this coming November. And if it's not, then it could be as soon as we have the next election, because until we fix the underlying problems, we're always going to have a setup that is ripe for civil unrest. So anyhow, hopefully it's a landslide. One side wins by so much that the other couldn't possibly feel like they got cheated. And that's that, and then we have a peaceful transition. And we get on with making the financial mess that we've been making for such a long time and trying to start World War III. There are just so many things going on that if the election is not the cause of massive civil unrest, we'll forget about it in a heartbeat and move on to the other crises that we're creating.
I just wanted to comment because I agree with everything you just said. And one of the most salient points there, I think, is that ability or the desire of those in charge to maintain power when they no longer deserve it or they haven't earned, the trust of the people. They have squandered that and abused that trust and basically not upheld their duty and so on, is to try to find some way to divert attention from that and to divert blame and to find a scapegoat, and sometimes that means something catastrophic to be brought out just because then, oh, look, there's this emergency over here. And constitutional attorney Dr. Edwin Vieira, whom we interview, says he points out that neither in the Declaration of Independence nor the Constitution does the word emergency appear. There is no such thing as emergency powers in our Constitution. And so people need to work closely with their sheriffs to help support their local sheriff, who is constitutional law officer, reporting to the people, not to the governor, not to the president, not to the mayor, etc., and help to maintain a civil society and civil relationships in their community as was intended by the original founding fathers. That's why they talked about the orderly militia. Everybody is supposed to be a member of that. So anyway, we've lost a lot of those institutions that are grassroots, truly grassroots. And now it's going to be quite tempting for those to follow in charge who are unable to to keep themselves out of the mess that they've made, and it not becoming obvious to everyone who's at fault, to be able to say, oh, look, we've got this emergency, whether it's a medical emergency or whether it's a riots emergency or whatever kind of emergency has to be so-called created to try to divert us. We need to resist the temptation to fall into fear and panic and just go, oh, I guess we've got to follow whoever appears to be holding the microphone at the time when they declare that there's an emergency. So anyway, so it reminds me of the last scene of, or next to last scene of the Wizard of Oz, where the man behind the curtain says, to pay no attention to the little man behind the curtain, and he's got bigger fire and bigger fire. We have to make war? What do we got to do to get you to believe that you need to step in line and abandon your expectations of sovereignty and law and order and that sort of thing, and not give up your privacy? This whole thing about, let's temporarily suspend the Constitution so that we can get this mess under control. The Patriot Act showed us that it's not temporary. It's never temporary. So, John, much more to talk about. We'll have to pick up next time. Folks, check out John's Substack, and we'll put the link to that in the description of this video. As always, John, thanks for joining us on Liberty and Finance. I'll give you the last word if you had anything to add from what we were just talking about.
Thanks, Dan. Again, now, we could go on for 2 hours with all the things that are going on in the world, and we'll just have to schedule a time to come back and pick it up again.
All right. Thanks, John.
Thanks. See you, Dan.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for June 3rd through June 10th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 2023 1-ounce Gold Britannia at just $59 over spot. We also have backdated 1-ounce Silver Britannia at $3.10 over spot. Next, we have pre-33 XF Gold $10 Liberty coins at just $59 over melt. And finally, we have a highly limited supply of 1/10 ounce Platinum Britannia at $59 over melt. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.